The year is 1935, and Caroline Henderson stands in her Oklahoma farmyard, watching the sky turn black at noon. But this isn't a storm cloud approaching. It's a wall of dirt stretching 2 miles high, moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying the topsoil of 3 states in its belly. Caroline doesn't know it yet, but she's witnessing the birth of modern America. As the black blizzard engulfs her farm, Caroline runs for her house, a wet cloth pressed to her face. Inside, she'll spend the next 4 hours in total darkness, listening to dirt particles pepper her windows like bullets. When the storm finally passes, she'll find sand drifts reaching her second-story windows and dust so fine it seeped through every crack, coating her dinner table, her children's beds, even the inside of her sealed mason jars. But Caroline is one of the lucky ones. She'll survive. Millions of others won't be so fortunate. What caused the worst environmental disaster in American history? The answer might surprise you. It wasn't just drought, it wasn't just wind. The Dust Bowl was man-made, created by a perfect storm of greed, ignorance, and the relentless pursuit of the American dream. And its consequences would reshape not just the landscape of the Great Plains, but the very soul of America itself. 20 years before that Black Sunday in 1935, the Great Plains were covered in a carpet of buffalo grass so dense you couldn't push a knife through its roots. Native Americans had lived on these plains for thousands of years, following the massive herds of bison that grazed on grass perfectly adapted to the harsh climate. The buffalo grass had evolved over millennia to survive in a land where drought was not the exception, but the rule. Then came World War I, and everything changed. As European farmland turned into battlefields, America became the world's breadbasket. Wheat prices soared to unprecedented heights, from 88 cents a bushel in 1914 to over $2 by 1917. Suddenly, every acre of the Great Plains looked like a gold mine waiting to be harvested. The government launched a propaganda campaign that would make Don Draper proud. The Great Plowup, they called it. Posters proclaimed, "Wheat will win the war," and "Plant more wheat." The message was clear. Turning prairie into farmland wasn't just profitable, it was patriotic. Homesteaders flooded into the Plain States. Between 1909 and 1929, settlers plowed up 33 million acres of grassland, an area larger than the entire state of New York. They used a revolutionary new technology, the one-way disc plow, which could tear through buffalo grass roots that had defeated previous generations of farmers. But here's what those farmers didn't understand, and what the agricultural experts refused to believe. The buffalo grass wasn't just decoration. Those deep, tangled roots were the only thing holding the soil together. Jess Willard, a wheat farmer from Kansas, later recalled those boom years. "We thought we were the smartest generation that ever lived. We had tractors, we had plows that could break prairie faster than anything before. We looked at that endless grassland and saw nothing but wasted opportunity. Every square mile we didn't plant seemed like money left on the table." The newly turned soil was incredibly fertile, black as coal and rich with nutrients accumulated over centuries. Wheat yields were extraordinary. Farmers who had started with nothing became wealthy almost overnight. Towns sprung up across the plains, seemingly from thin air. Banks couldn't loan money fast enough. It was the original American gold rush, except the gold was grain. Then came 1930. The rain stopped falling. Not just for a few weeks or months, but for years. The worst drought in recorded American history had begun, but drought alone wouldn't have created the Dust Bowl. Native grassland could survive years without significant rainfall. The buffalo grass would go dormant, its roots reaching down 20 feet to find moisture, waiting patiently for better times. But there was no buffalo grass left. In its place lay millions of acres of naked soil, baking under a merciless sun. By 1931, the wind began to blow, and with no grass roots to anchor it, the topsoil simply lifted off. Entire farms rose into the sky and disappeared forever. The dirt didn't just blow around locally, it traveled incredible distances. Dust from Texas farms fell on ships 300 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. Farmers in Nebraska found their fields buried under soil that had originated in New Mexico. The storms had names: Black Sunday, Black Tuesday, the Black Roller. But locals had their own terminology. They called them dusters, black blizzards, or simply the dirt. Children who had never seen rain began to think that dust storms were normal weather. Dr. Hugh Bennett, a soil scientist who would later become known as the father of soil conservation, was in Washington, D.C. on April 14, 1935, Black Sunday, trying to convince Congress to fund soil conservation programs. As he testified before a skeptical committee, the sky outside began to darken. By the time he finished speaking, dust from the Great Plains had reached the nation's capital, turning day to night 500 miles from where the storm began. Bennett looked at the stunned congressman and said, "Gentlemen, that's what I've been talking about." The Soil Conservation Act was passed immediately. But for millions of Americans living in the Dust Bowl, help was coming too late. Welcome to Professor Archive, where history comes alive through the stories that shaped our world. I'm fascinated by how many of you are watching this right now from all corners of the globe. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Are you a student cramming for an exam at 2 a.m.? A history teacher preparing tomorrow's lesson? Or maybe you're just someone who, like me, finds these human stories irresistible. If this deep dive into history enriches your day, consider showing your support with a super thanks. It helps me continue bringing these forgotten stories to light. Now, back to 1935, where entire families were making impossible choices. The human cost of the Dust Bowl defies easy statistics. How do you quantify the weight of despair in a farmer's chest as he watches his life's work literally blow away? How do you measure the fear in a mother's eyes as her children develop dust pneumonia, their lungs filling with the microscopic particles that no amount of wet cloth could filter out? Woody Guthrie, who lived through the Dust Bowl and would later write songs about it, described the psychological impact. The dust was like a living thing. It got into your head, into your dreams. You'd wake up spitting dirt, and you'd go to sleep with the taste of your farm in your mouth. After a while, you started to wonder if you were disappearing too, one grain at a time. Medical records from the era paint a grim picture. Hospitals reported a 300% increase in respiratory ailments. A new disease entered the medical vocabulary: dust pneumonia. Children were the most vulnerable. Their developing lungs couldn't cope with the constant inhalation of fine silica particles. In liberal Kansas, the local hospital ran out of oxygen tents. In Guymon, Oklahoma, they started hanging wet sheets in schoolrooms, creating makeshift air filters that needed changing every hour. But the most heartbreaking stories weren't making it into medical records. They were whispered in churches and general stores, passed along in letters to relatives. Babies born with dust in their lungs, elderly folks who simply gave up and died, and countless families who loaded everything they owned into broken-down cars and headed west, joining the largest internal migration in American history. These weren't just random victims of a natural disaster. These were people who had believed in the American promise that hard work and perseverance would be rewarded. John Steinbeck would later call them Okies, though they came from Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and Nebraska too. But the name stuck, carrying with it a weight of shame and desperation that would follow families for generations. The exodus began in 1932 and continued throughout the decade. An estimated 3.5 million people abandoned the Great Plains. They packed their Model T Fords and ancient trucks with everything they could carry: mattresses, cooking pots, photographs, and hope. What they couldn't take, they often had to abandon or sell for pennies on the dollar. Route 66 became known as the Mother Road, the main artery carrying Dust Bowl refugees toward the promised land of California. But these weren't leisurely road trips. Families would travel with their radiators boiling, their tires worn smooth, stopping every few miles to let overloaded engines cool down. Children would walk alongside the cars to reduce weight on steep hills. At night, they'd camp by the roadside, sharing beans and stories with other refugee families. The journey west was perilous. Cars broke down constantly. Families ran out of money hundreds of miles from anywhere. Some turned back, defeated. Others pressed on, selling possessions along the way to buy gasoline and food. The lucky ones had relatives in California who could help. The unlucky ones arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a determination to survive. But California wasn't the golden land they'd imagined. The state was already struggling with unemployment from the Great Depression. When hundreds of thousands of Dust Bowl refugees arrived, they found themselves unwanted and unwelcome. Okies Go Home signs appeared in shop windows. Local police set up roadblocks at the California border, turning away families who couldn't prove they had jobs waiting. Those who made it through found themselves competing for agricultural jobs that paid starvation wages. Entire families would work in the fields from sunrise to sunset, picking fruit and vegetables, living in ramshackle camps without running water or electricity. The irony was bitter. People who had lost their farms to drought were now working other people's farms for less money than they'd ever imagined possible. Yet something remarkable happened during this mass migration. The diverse mix of people from across the Great Plains began to develop a shared identity. They brought with them their music, their stories, their ways of cooking and celebrating. In the labor camps of California, country music evolved, incorporating the experiences of displacement and hardship. This cultural fusion would eventually influence everything from folk music to literature to political activism. Meanwhile, back in the Dust Bowl, those who stayed behind faced a different kind of challenge. The federal government, under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, began implementing unprecedented conservation programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted over 200 million trees in shelter belts, designed to break the wind and hold the soil. The Soil Conservation Service taught farmers new techniques: contour plowing, crop rotation, and leaving stubble in the fields to anchor the dirt. But perhaps the most controversial program was the government's decision to buy out the most damaged farms and return them to grassland. Entire towns were purchased and abandoned, creating what locals called the bought-out lands. These ghost towns scattered across the plains serve as monuments to humanity's hubris and nature's revenge. The ecological lessons of the Dust Bowl went far beyond agriculture. Scientists began to understand that the Great Plains ecosystem was far more complex and fragile than anyone had realized. The buffalo grass that settlers had viewed as worthless weeds was actually a sophisticated network of plants perfectly adapted to the harsh climate. Its roots didn't just anchor the soil, they created underground communities of fungi and bacteria that helped other plants survive drought. Dr. Frederick Clements, a pioneering ecologist, spent the 1930s documenting how the destruction of native grasslands had cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. Without grass to slow the wind, soil temperatures increased dramatically. Without organic matter from decomposing grass roots, the soil lost its ability to retain moisture. The intricate balance that had sustained life on the Great Plains for thousands of years had been destroyed in less than 2 decades. But nature, as it always does, began to adapt. Hardy weeds like Russian thistle, tumbleweeds, moved in to fill the ecological void. These weren't native plants, but immigrants themselves, brought accidentally from Europe in wheat shipments. The tumbleweed became a symbol of the Dust Bowl, rolling endlessly across abandoned farmlands. But it was actually nature's attempt to heal the wounded landscape. By 1939, the rains finally returned to the Great Plains, and the worst of the dust storms ended. But America had been fundamentally changed. The Dust Bowl had shattered the myth of endless abundance that had defined American expansion since the colonial era. For the first time, Americans had to confront the possibility that the continent's resources weren't infinite, that the land itself could be destroyed by human activity. The environmental movement, though it wouldn't get that name for another 30 years, was born in the dust storms of the 1930s. Aldo Leopold, a forester who witnessed the destruction of the plains, began developing what he called a land ethic, the radical idea that humans had moral obligations to the soil, water, and wildlife. His ideas would eventually influence everyone from Rachel Carson to the founders of Earth Day. The Dust Bowl also fundamentally altered American politics. The disaster proved that environmental problems couldn't be solved by individual action alone. They required government intervention on a massive scale. The federal conservation programs of the 1930s established the precedent for everything from the Clean Air Act to the Endangered Species Act. The idea that protecting the environment was a legitimate role of government was born in the black blizzards of the Great Plains. Perhaps most importantly, the Dust Bowl migration changed American culture forever. The Okies who headed west brought with them new ways of thinking about community, resilience, and social justice. Many became involved in labor organizing, having learned firsthand how quickly prosperity could turn to poverty. Their children and grandchildren would become leaders in the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, and the fight for workers' rights. The music that emerged from the Dust Bowl experience, from Woody Guthrie's protest songs to the country music of displaced farmers, gave voice to the struggles of ordinary people in ways that had never been heard before in American popular culture. These weren't songs about romantic love or good times. They were about survival, dignity, and the determination to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, brought the Dust Bowl experience to middle-class Americans who had never known such hardship. The novel was controversial, banned in many libraries and denounced by politicians, but it won the Pulitzer Prize and helped build support for programs to help displaced families. More importantly, it established the idea that literature could be a powerful tool for social change. The technological innovations developed in response to the Dust Bowl also had lasting impact. New farming techniques pioneered by the Soil Conservation Service, including no-till farming and precision agriculture, are still used today. The weather monitoring systems developed to track dust storms became the foundation for modern meteorology. Even seemingly simple innovations, like the face mask designed to filter dust, contributed to advances in public health and industrial safety. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. The Dust Bowl generation had lived through the collapse of everything they'd believed about progress and prosperity. They'd learned that hard work wasn't always rewarded, that nature could be more powerful than technology, and that communities had to take care of their most vulnerable members or risk losing everything. This hard-earned wisdom would shape how America responded to future crises. When World War II began, Dust Bowl survivors brought their experience with rationing, conservation, and community cooperation to the war effort. When the environmental crisis of the 1960s and 70s emerged, many of the leaders were children of Dust Bowl families who had learned not to take clean air and water for granted. The story doesn't end in the 1930s, though. Climate scientists today warn that rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns could create conditions similar to those that caused the original Dust Bowl. Parts of the Great Plains are already experiencing prolonged drought, and some of the conservation practices established in the 1930s are being abandoned in favor of more intensive agriculture. In 2012, a severe drought hit the same regions devastated by the Dust Bowl, and dust storms returned to the Great Plains. While modern farming techniques prevented a complete repeat of the 1930s disaster, the storms served as a reminder that the lessons of the Dust Bowl are not just historical curiosities. They're urgent warnings about what happens when we ignore the limits of the natural world. Today, as you drive across the Great Plains, you can still see evidence of the Dust Bowl. Abandoned farmhouses sit surrounded by carefully planted shelter belts, their windows boarded up, their stories slowly being forgotten. But you can also see the recovery: vast stretches of restored prairie grass, wind farms generating clean energy, and farming communities that have learned to work with nature rather than against it. The Dust Bowl changed America forever because it forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about progress, prosperity, and the relationship between humans and the environment. It showed that the American dream, pursued without regard for consequences, could become an American nightmare. But it also demonstrated the resilience of the American spirit, the ability to learn from catastrophic mistakes and build something better from the ruins. Caroline Henderson, the Oklahoma farmer we met at the beginning of this story, never left her farm. She and her husband rode out the entire Dust Bowl, planting trees, improving their soil conservation practices, and writing letters that documented the human cost of environmental destruction. In 1953, she wrote, "We have learned that nature bats last and her cleanup hitters are drought, erosion, and abandonment. But we have also learned that with knowledge, humility, and hard work, even the most damaged land can be healed." While it's subtitled, the dust has settled, but the lessons remain. In our age of climate change, rising seas, and environmental uncertainty, the story of the Dust Bowl is more relevant than ever. It reminds us that the Earth's resources are not infinite, that environmental destruction can happen with shocking speed, and that the communities that survive are those that learn to live within nature's limits rather than trying to conquer them. The black blizzards of the 1930s may be history, but the choices that created them are still with us. Every time we decide between short-term profit and long-term sustainability, between individual gain and community welfare, between human convenience and environmental protection, we're facing the same fundamental questions that confronted Caroline Henderson as she watched that wall of dirt approach her farm. The Dust Bowl changed America forever because it taught us that our fate is inseparably linked to the fate of the land itself. That lesson, learned in the hardest way possible, may be the most important inheritance we carry from those who survived the black blizzards and lived to plant the seeds of a more sustainable future. As we face our own environmental challenges, we would do well to remember their courage, their resilience, and their hard-won wisdom. The dust may have settled, but their story continues in every choice we make about how to live on this earth. That's all for today's deep dive into how the Dust Bowl changed America forever. If you found yourself transported back to the 1930s Great Plains alongside me, and this story gave you a new perspective on one of America's most defining disasters, I'd be grateful if you hit that like button and consider subscribing to Professor Archive. Your support keeps these forgotten chapters of history alive. Until next time, keep exploring the past to understand our present.